Most writers in accounting for the origin of dueling, derive it from the warlike habits of those barbarous nations who overran Europe in the early centuries of the Christian era, and who knew no mode so effectual for settling their differences as the point of the sword. In fact, dueling, taken in its primitive and broadest sense, means nothing more than combating, and is the universal resort of all animals, including man, to gain or defend their possessions or avenge their insults. As civilization advanced, the best informed men naturally grew ashamed of such a mode of adjusting disputes, and the promulgation of some sort of laws for obtaining redress for injuries was the consequence. Still, there were many cases in which the allegations of an accuser could not be rebutted by any positive proof on the part of the accused. In all these, which must have been exceedingly numerous in the early stages of European society, the combat was resorted to. From its decision there was no appeal. God was supposed to nerve the arm of the combatant whose cause was just, and to grant him the victory over his opponent. Their manners being wholly warlike, the man deficient in courage, which was the prime virtue of his fellows, was not unreasonably suspected of other vices besides cowardice, which is generally found to be coexistent with treachery. He who showed himself most valiant in the encounter was absolved by public opinion from any crime with which he might be charged. As a necessary consequence, society would have been reduced to its original elements, if the men of thought, as distinguished from the men of action, had not devised some means for taming the unruly passions of their fellows. With this view, governments commenced by restricting within the narrowest possible limits the cases in which it was lawful to prove or deny guilt by the single combat. The clergy, whose dominion was an intellectual one, never approved of a system of jurisprudence which tended so much to bring all things under the rule of the strongest arm. From the first they set their faces against dueling, and endeavored, as far as the prejudices of their age would allow them, to curb the warlike spirit so alien from the principles of religion. But it was the blasphemous error of these early ages to expect that the Almighty, whenever he was called upon, would work a miracle in favor of a person unjustly accused. The priesthood, in condemning the duel, did not condemn the principle on which it was founded. They still encouraged the popular belief of divine interference in all the disputes or differences that might arise among nations or individuals. It was the very same principle that regulated the ordeals, which with all their influence they supported against the duel. By the former, the power of deciding the guilt or innocence was vested wholly in their hand. By the latter they enjoyed no power or privilege at all. It is not to be wondered at that they should have endeavored to settle all differences by the peaceful mode. While that prevailed, they were the first party in the state. But while the strong arm of individual prowess was allowed to be the judge in all doubtful cases, their power and influence became secondary to those of the nobility. Thus it was not the mere hatred of bloodshed which induced them to launch the thunderbolts of excommunication against the combatants. It was a desire to retain the power, which, to do them justice, they were in those times the persons best qualified to wield. To centralize this power in the Church and make it the judge of the last resort in all appeals, both in civil and criminal cases, they instituted 5 modes of trial, the management of which lay wholly in their hands. These were, the oath upon the Evangelists, the ordeal of the cross and the fire ordeal for persons in the higher ranks, the water ordeal for the humbler classes, and, lastly, the bread and cheese ordeal for members of their own body. The oath upon the Evangelists was taken in the following manner. The accused who was received to this proof swore upon a copy of the New Testament, and on the relics of the holy martyrs or on their tombs that he was innocent of the crime imputed to him. He was also obliged to find 12 persons of acknowledged probity who should take oath at the same time that they believed him innocent. This mode of trial led to very great abuses. This abuse was one of the principal causes which led to the preference given to the trial by battle. It is not at all surprising that a feudal baron should have preferred the chances of a fair fight with his opponent to a mode by which firm perjury would always be successful. The trial by the cross, which Charlemagne begged his sons to have recourse to in case of disputes arising between them, was performed thus. When a person accused of any crime had declared his innocence upon oath, and appealed to the cross for its judgment in his favor, he was brought into the church before the altar. The priests previously prepared 2 sticks exactly like one another, upon one of which was carved a figure of the cross. They were both wrapped up with great care and many ceremonies in a quantity of fine wool and laid upon the altar or on the relics of the saints. A solemn prayer was then offered up to God, that he would be pleased to discover, by the judgment of his holy cross, whether the accused person were innocent or guilty. A priest then approached the altar and took up one of the sticks, and the assistants unwrapped it reverently. If it was marked with the cross, the accused person was innocent. If unmarked, he was guilty. It would be unjust to assert that the judgments thus delivered were in some cases erroneous. And it would be absurd to believe that they were left altogether to chance. Many true judgments were doubtless given, and in all probability most conscientiously. For the priests endeavored beforehand to convince themselves by secret inquiry and a strict examination of the circumstances, whether the appellant were innocent or guilty, and that they took up the crossed or uncrossed stick accordingly. Although to all other observers the sticks, as enfolded in the wool, might appear exactly similar, those who wrapped them could, without any difficulty, distinguish the one from the other. By the fire ordeal the power of deciding was just as unequivocally left in their hands. It was generally believed that fire would not burn the innocent, and the clergy took care that the innocent, or such as it was their pleasure or interest to declare so, should be so warned before undergoing the ordeal as to preserve themselves without any difficulty from the fire. One mode of ordeal was to place red-hot plowshares on the ground at certain distances, and blindfolding the accused person, make them walk barefooted over them. If the accused stepped regularly in the vacant spaces, avoiding the fire, they were adjudged innocent. If he burned himself, he was declared guilty. As none but the clergy interfered with the arrangement of the plowshares, they could always calculate beforehand the result of the ordeal. To find a person guilty, they had only to place them at irregular distances, and the accused was sure to tread upon one of them. This ordeal was called the Udicum Dei and sometimes the Vulgaris Purgatio, and might also be tried by several other methods. One was to hold in the hand, unhurt, a piece of red-hot iron of the weight 3 pounds. Not only men with hard hands, but women of softer and more delicate skin could do this with impunity. It is reasonable to conjecture that on occasion the apparently hot iron was merely cold iron painted red. As regards the water ordeal, the same trouble was not taken. It was a trial only for the poor and humble, and whether they sank or swam was thought of very little consequence. Like the witches of more modern times, the accused were thrown into a pond or river. If they sank and were drowned, their surviving friends had the consolation of knowing that they were innocent. If they swam, they were guilty. In either case society was rid of them. But of all the ordeals, that which the clergy reserved for themselves was the one least likely to cause any member of their corps to be declared guilty. The most culpable monster in existence came off clear when tried by this method. It was called the coarsened, and was thus performed. A piece of barley bread and a piece of cheese were laid upon the altar, and the accused priest, in his full canonical garnishments, and surrounded by all the pompous adjuncts of Catholic ceremony, pronounced certain conjurations and prayed with great fervency for several minutes. The burden of the prayer was that if he were guilty of the crime laid to his charge, God would send his angel Gabriel to stop his throat, that he might not be able to swallow the bread and cheese. There is no instance upon record of a priest having been choked in this manner.